Facilitating 5-MeO DMT by Martin W. Ball, editor. Editor's Introduction. Back in early 2008, when I had my first full-release dose experience of 5-MeO DMT, I knew a grand total of one person in the entire world who facilitated with this powerful and theogenic molecule. At that time, even in psychedelic culture, very few people had ever heard of 5-MeO DMT, and back then, when mentioning it to others in the community, they'd almost always respond with, "You mean DMT?" No, not even close. Back in 2008, the world was hot for DMT. Heavily influenced by Terence McKenna and his proclamation that DMT was the most powerful psychedelic available, along with his, in my opinion, patently absurd musings on machine elves, 2012, the end of history, the transcendental object at the end of time, UFOs, the alien other, and speculations on translinguistic matter, the psychedelic community was basically of the opinion that DMT was the thing. And not only that, but that the world was heading towards some kind of apocalyptic transformation that would come about in 2012, and it was all related to DMT in one manner or another. There was even widespread speculation on the internet that December 21st, 2012 would feature a magnetic pole shift on Earth which, somehow, would trigger a global release of DMT in the pineal glands of all humans on Earth simultaneously, ushering us all collectively into the new age of, who knows what. Obviously, nothing of the sort ever happened, because it was all nonsense and pure psychobabble to begin with. No UFOs manifested to deliver humanity into the arms of the galactic community. There was no grand ascension, and the transcendental object at the end of time never materialized. The DMT-infused fantasy was a grand dud and a great big nothing. With the exception of fantasy and sci-fi epics, where fulfillment of prophecy is central to plot and character development, Paul, Anakin, Harry, Rand, Siri, Marani. That's how all real-life prophecies tend to play out. Lots of hype, not much reality. McKenna favored DMT over 5-MeO DMT because, as he put it, 5-MeO DMT only produced a feeling, whereas, far more significantly to his mind and personal tastes, he really hallucinated on DMT at a level that was far beyond any other psychedelic, and therefore, he proclaimed it to be the heart of the psychedelic experience. From the vantage point of 2022, a full decade beyond the supposed end of history of 2012, I think that many, though my thoughts were completely dismissed by the larger psychedelic community at the time, in 2008, would now agree that McKenna completely missed the point. And while his metaphysics enjoyed widespread support pre-2012, with the complete failure of anything actually happening, his views can now be looked at as quaint, entertaining, amusing, perhaps inspiring, but certainly not grounded in any kind of objective reality. Furthermore, back in 2008, Rick Strassman's 2001 book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, was just being made into a widely viewed film by the same name, narrated by Joe Rogan. Strassman's work was groundbreaking primarily in the sense that he was the first researcher to be granted permission by the U.S. federal government to perform human subject research with an illegal psychedelic substance in over 2 decades, helping to usher in a new age of scientific research on psychedelics. Over the course of his research, Strassman developed his somewhat confusing and physics-challenging interpretation of DMT as allowing a tuning in to channel dark matter. Similar to the endemic insertion of theoretical physics into spirituality and psychedelic theory building, Strassman speculated that DMT allows humans to tune in to dark matter, a theoretical concept in astrophysics that has been introduced to account for the fact that a large portion of the mass of the universe appears to be missing from the observable electromagnetic spectrum. In other words, there seems to be a vast amount of stuff out there that is undetectable by scientific instruments, yet appears to shape and mold the structure of the observable universe, thus dark matter. Those who espouse spiritual, religious, and metaphysical views have been eager to bolster their beliefs and interpretations with cutting-edge science ever since the advent of modern science. Pick up any book by a contemporary New Age author, and you're almost guaranteed that there will be some reference made to quantum mechanics, multiple universes, dark matter, and the like, making the presentation sound science-y without actually being scientific at all. You could also pick up any writings from over 100 years ago by spiritualists, and you'll see the exact same phenomenon, just with cutting-edge scientific terms from that era. Heck, America even has an entire religion devoted to this wedding of science to religion, Christian Scientists. In the philosophy of science and religion, this is called the God of the Gaps problem, where something that is not proven in religion or spirituality is bolstered by its supposed connection to something that is not understood in science, a gap in knowledge. This has been a tendency in Western thought ever since the Enlightenment and rational science was distinguished from the faith of religion and separate areas of knowledge were carved out for each domain. Because the domain of rational science has been seen as dominant and authoritative, religion and spirituality have sought to bolster their own reality claims by importing spurious understandings of science into religion and spirituality. This is an endemic problem and far more akin to science fiction and fantasy than actual science. Lest anyone get the wrong idea, I fully support the use of science to help us understand the nature of reality and the nature of consciousness, but I don't ever support the use of God of the Gaps because it simply isn't scientific at all. It just appears that way to the uninformed. Strassman's presentation follows this model by speculating that various beings and other realms exist in dark matter, or also possibly in multiple realities multiverses, that individuals can experience and perceive when consuming DMT. I don't think you'd find a single astrophysicist who'd agree with this idea because astrophysicists are pretty clear about dark matter. They have no idea what it is, how it behaves, or what it's made of. So, the idea that it's filled with beings and realms we can tune into via DMT must be baffling to them. But it sounds cool. DMT gives you access to other beings and other realms and science. Strassman went further and speculated that because DMT is a natural mammalian neurotransmitter, it was responsible for the entry of the spirit to connect to the physical body in utero, which he correlated with the Tibetan Buddhist belief that individuated consciousness reincarnates by entering into a fetus 49 days after death, after having traversed the bardo, the in-between state of consciousness after death and prior to rebirth, as is detailed in the book of relatively minor importance in Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo Todal. For all these reasons, Strassman dubbed DMT the spirit molecule, and his, along with McKenna's views, became the gold standard in psychedelic discourse around DMT being the world's most significant psychedelic compound. Though Strassman is ultimately far more scientifically grounded than the wild tales and speculations produced by McKenna, and he was just doing his best to make sense of the data and experiences he was collecting from his test subjects and grappling with how to take them at face value. Together, their views cemented the idea in the psychedelic community that DMT must be very special, and it would be hard for anything else to compete with that specialness. To challenge this dominant narrative, back in 2008, I proclaimed on my podcast and in my writings that if DMT is, quote, the spirit molecule, then 5-MeO DMT is, quote, the God molecule. The idea went as follows. If DMT experiences are filled with all kinds of crazy psychedelic content of beings and realms, then by comparison, it's a lesser order experience to the sense of experiencing God as made accessible via 5-MeO DMT. You know, that feeling McKenna was referring to, but had nothing meaningful to say about. By putting the word God in there, I thought it would be the best shorthand reference for the beyond words profound magnitude of the experience and make its distinction from 5-MeO DMT unambiguous, clear, and easily referenced. I don't know if I would have decided to call 5-MeO DMT the God molecule if Strassman hadn't dubbed DMT the spirit molecule, and have that term widely adopted by psychedelic culture, but he did, so I did, and both terms have stuck, culturally speaking. It was at this point that I also started referring to 5-MeO DMT as the crown jewel of entheogens, and specifically identified what made it so profoundly unique. It, more than any other psychedelic molecule, granted reliable access to non-dual states of consciousness. At that time, the terms non-dual and non-duality were almost never used in psychedelic discourse. The world was far more fascinated by decidedly dualistic phenomena, beings, realms, spirits, etc., experiences that preserved, amplified, and accented the perceiving subject, perceived object, relationship, and apparent otherness. In my work, I've taken pains to distinguish between what I call the shamanic model of psychedelic experience in contrast with what I've articulated as the non-dual model of psychedelic experience. The shamanic model is all about spirits, realms, and otherness, whereas the non-dual model is about recognizing that all appearances are manifestations of one universal self, consciousness, or being. The world of self and other, me and the spirits, here and there, heaven and earth, physical and spiritual, and other such metaphysical dichotomies is dualistic in nature. Non-dual means not that. Non-dual means that reality, at its foundation, is unitary in nature and that all duality is merely apparent, but not fundamentally real in an absolute sense. The non-dual position could be stated thusly. There is, in reality, only one being or consciousness that exists, and everything that we sense, perceive, and experience, including ourselves, is this one being experiencing itself in different guises and forms, but in actuality is still just one. From this perspective, there's no such thing as otherness in psychedelic experiences. It is all an experience of oneself. Furthermore, the individuated sense of self, the egoic identity, is fundamentally a character through which the universal consciousness expresses and experiences itself. To put it bluntly, as I like to do, the only thing that actually exists is God. And that means that each and every one of us is a direct manifestation and embodiment of this one universal consciousness and being. In fact, everything that exists is this one universal being, parceled out into apparent subjects and objects, yet still fundamentally one. That's what happened to me upon that first full-release dose of 5-MeO DMT back in 2008. I experienced everything. My apparent, individuated, and ego-identified self included, as being one universal consciousness that was primarily made out of the universal energy of unconditional love and awareness. It's also my view and experience that this also means that we don't need to introduce concepts like souls or spirits, or even reincarnation, because everything already is one being, and the only thing that creates individuated perspectives is bodies, not spirits or souls, which I like to refer to as vehicles for the universal consciousness to experience and perceive itself through. I experienced myself as God. And since this was true for me, and as I wasn't fundamentally different from anyone else, this must be equally true for everyone and everything. If I, in my true nature, am God, then so is everyone else. So, I started making waves in the psychedelic world about the profound and unique significance of this amazing molecule, 5-MeO DMT. One of the first hurdles was the pushback against the designation of DMT as being the top psychedelic, as to my mind, it very clearly and obviously wasn't. Second was to articulate just what the 5-MeO DMT experience was and how profoundly different it was from not just DMT, but other entheogens and psychedelics as well. Third was the injection of the language of non-duality into psychedelic discourse, and to open up the conversation in the psychedelic world around the concept of God, which was almost completely absent in psychedelic discourse at the time. Today, some 14 years after my first full experience with 5-MeO DMT, we live in a very different world. The terms I first introduced around 5-MeO DMT, such as the God molecule and the crown jewel of entheogens, are now widely used around the world when discussing 5-MeO DMT. While there is still some confusion around the idea that 5-MeO DMT is not DMT, it is much more widely understood that these are two very different molecules and that the experiences they make accessible to human consciousness bear very little resemblance to each other. Additionally, well-known individuals, such as the son of the President of the United States, Hunter Biden, and celebrities such as Mike Tyson, have professed how their lives were transformed by 5-MeO DMT via the use of the secretions of the Sonoran Desert toad, also known as the Colorado River toad. And articles about this molecule can now be found across the media spectrum, so there's much more awareness of 5-MeO DMT than ever. Though he did not enjoy the experience at all, it was also featured in Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which, ironically, is one of the best-selling books in the world about psychedelics, though written by someone who was a virtual newbie to the psychedelic scene. In the process, 5-MeO DMT has now come to eclipse interest in DMT, and it's decidedly a hot topic worldwide. In contrast to 2008, I now personally know of numerous individuals, and countless more I don't know, around the world who work with and facilitate experiences with 5-MeO DMT. Most are relatively new to the practice. Some have been at it for a while. The old guards in the psychedelic world intentionally kept quiet about 5-MeO DMT, in part to reserve it for elite circles of psychonauts, and also to keep it off the radar of federal drug warriors. 5-MeO DMT was shared in closely guarded circles, and even some churches, but it wasn't talked about openly. It was extra super double top secret, and very few had access to it, or even knew what it was. But the world is very different now. I, not being connected to the old guard in any way, after my first experience with 5-MeO DMT, started belting out about it from the proverbial rooftops. It became a regular topic on my podcast, The Entheogenic Evolution, which I started in early 2008, and was featured prominently in my 2008 book of the same name. Shortly thereafter, James Orrock's book, Tryptamine Palace, was published in 2009. At that point, the toad was out of the bag, and the world was destined to learn about 5-MeO-DMT, whether the old psychedelic guard wanted it to or not. For their own reasons, legislators in the federal government of the United States decided to designate 5-MeO-DMT a Schedule I illegal substance in this country effective January 19th of 2011. It's been reported that one of the issues under consideration was an unverified report that one person had died while consuming 5-MeO-DMT in the form of secretions of the Sonoran desert toad. So, gotta protect the children, or something like that. Some countries have followed suit, and others have not sought to make access to 5-MeO-DMT illegal. Currently, there's a patchwork of legal access to and illegal prohibition of 5-MeO-DMT around the world. For example, it's an illegal felony here in the United States, but not across the borders in either Mexico or Canada, two places where facilitation of the 5-MeO-DMT experience have flourished. It's flourished here in the U.S. too, but it's mostly underground, secret, and protective of facilitators and participants alike. There are a few above-ground churches where toad secretions are served as a religious sacrament, but they have yet to be tested in court on the question of whether the federal government needs to extend religious freedom exemptions to them under the umbrella of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Personally, I see access to 5-MeO-DMT and psychedelics in general as a universal human right. This is especially so with 5-MeO-DMT because, as the God molecule, it provides access to the most profound experience available to human beings, the experience of absolute oneness in our inherent divinity as manifestations of God. To my mind, I can't think of a more fundamental human right than this. Not everyone goes all the way with 5-MeO-DMT, and elsewhere, I've articulated all the various ways that the ego, out of resistance or even necessity, can get in the way of the full experience. But the potential is there, and there in a way that we don't generally find with other psychedelics, except in exceptional circumstances. In theory, though not always in practice, anyone can smoke or vaporize 5-MeO-DMT and, within mere seconds, can have a direct experience of their true nature as God or the unitary being and universal consciousness. That's pretty fucking profound. It doesn't matter what your background is, what you believe, what religion you belong to, or what spirituality you follow, what you want or don't want to be true. It just presents this absoluteness to the one experiencing it. This is it. Entire religions and spiritual traditions have been built around developing methodologies to help people experience this profound state of consciousness and embodied awareness. That a mere molecule can do in a few seconds what even a lifetime of spiritual practice may or may not achieve is a pretty profound thing and a potential game changer for humanity. Just imagine, anyone can have this experience. If ever a great equalizer were available to humanity, this is it. All one needs is access, and hopefully, skillful facilitation. To say that experiencing 5-MeO-DMT can be monumental and profoundly life-changing is not in any way hyperbole or overstatement. If there's anything on earth that is truly and reliably mind-blowing, this is it, and in spades. The context in which one is served can have a deep impact on how the experience is received, processed, and integrated. It can swing wildly from profoundly liberating and ecstasy-inducing to deeply traumatic and horrifying. There are a lot of "it depends" in there. As I like to say, even with something as reliably non-dual as 5-MeO-DMT, results vary. other than an unfathomably massive influx and amplification of energy. There are no guarantees. As such, education, preparation, setting, and facilitation are all extremely important. But with 5-MeO-DMT, unlike the case of iboga, ayahuasca, San Pedro, peyote, and mushrooms, there are no long-standing traditions of how to serve or work with this molecule. While there have been Central American indigenous cultures that have traditionally used a snuff made with seeds that contain 5-MeO-DMT, yopo, the smoking and vaporizing of 5-MeO-DMT is a decidedly modern phenomenon and is how the majority of individuals are introduced to this powerful molecule. It can also be taken nasally, depending on the form of the molecule, or anally. Yet the most widespread use is through smoking or vaporizing, where the experience begins within a few heartbeats and things very quickly go from 0 to infinity. And while there are now a number of indigenous cultures in the Americas who have been introduced to toad medicine by Dr. Octavio Rettig and subsequently adopted its use into their ceremonies and cultures, it's just as new there as it is anywhere else. While some of the cultures Rettig has introduced toad medicine do have prior use of entheogens, many don't, and none have had a clear or unambiguous historical use of 5-MeO-DMT prior to his introduction. Elsewhere, primarily in my 2017 book, Entheogenic Liberation, I discuss what I've learned to be the significant factors for working with 5-MeO-DMT and the energetic process it engenders in relation to the energetic patterning and structures of the human ego. While more books and writings about 5-MeO-DMT and the Sonoran Desert Toad have appeared over the years, Entheogenic Liberation is the most comprehensive about just what the experience is and how to work with it. In writing that book, I set out to create the guidebook that I didn't have when I was going through my own process with 5-MeO-DMT, and used my years as a facilitator of working energetically one-on-one with clients with this powerful tool as the source material for all that is presented in it. This book here has a very different aim. I urge the reader to take this as something of an anthropological or sociological survey that is not intended as being overtly evaluative or instructive, though various contributors to this volume do offer their own perspectives on what is best and what isn't. Because the serving of 5-MeO-DMT is fast becoming a global phenomenon, what I've done is invited various facilitators to share with the reader what their practices, concerns, philosophies, and methods are. This should not be considered an endorsement of anything presented within this book. This is not an attempt to articulate what's best or how it should be done, or a guide for those who want to start facilitating. It is, however, an attempt to relate just a small sample of what's happening out there in the world with 5-MeO-DMT. It is by no means comprehensive. It's just a snapshot. It is a window into the thoughts and practices of various 5-MeO-DMT facilitators from around the world. In putting this book together, I sent out a proposal to many of the 5-MeO-DMT facilitators whom I personally knew, and also invited them to forward the book proposal onto others that they might know. I also put out an open call on social media. The result is that some of the entries in this book come from people I know personally, and others are from people I've never met or even spoken to. Of all the submissions, only one comes from someone I've personally experienced 5-MeO-DMT with, and this is Hal from the Temple of Awakening Divinity. My own personal feeling is that the only real way to evaluate anyone's approach to working with the psychedelic medicine is to participate in their unique way of facilitating, and therefore direct experience is fundamental and necessary to evaluating anyone's practice in any truly meaningful sense. In other words, if you haven't experienced it with this particular person in this particular context, then you don't really know what it's like. Given that I only have direct experience with one of the individuals featured in this book, It should be clear that I am not offering any kind of evaluation or endorsement of anything presented by contributors. I'm allowing them the space and opportunity to speak for themselves and present how they go about doing what they do, why, and how they came into the practice. While I presented potential contributors with a series of questions for them to consider, I also made it clear that individuals could represent themselves and their practices in any way they wanted, and they had the freedom to focus on and articulate what's important to them. Some contributors answered the questions I asked, and others created their own statement or followed their own format. The overriding concern was that everyone speaks from their own experience and practice, and to take this as an opportunity to tell their stories as they saw fit. The question prompts I provided to potential contributors were as follows. How were you introduced to 5, Toad? What was your experience? How did you become a facilitator and why? What, if any, training did you receive? How do you conduct sessions? How would you describe your approach? Non-dual, shamanic, ceremonial, therapeutic? Do you work one-on-one, in groups, in retreats, at a center, with a team? What do you see as the purpose of working with 5? If you use unconventional or controversial methods, what is the rationale? In your own view, how does it serve your practice? How do you handle issues of informed consent? What do people get out of their sessions, experiences? Do you provide pre-session information, screening, prep? If so, what? What are some of the best results you've seen? What are some of the difficulties you've encountered with patients or clients? What are your recommendations for integration and post-experience processing? What resources do you use or recommend to clients? How many people have you served, and what kinds of people have you worked with? Drug addicts, spiritual seekers, vets, ages, genders, occupations, interests, nationalities, ethnicities. Do you see different issues between serving men and women, old and young, healthy, and those with medical issues? What do you feel are the responsibilities of those serving 5? Do you have an opinion on synthetic versus natural? If you choose to work with Toad, what's your take on sustainable harvesting, toad protections, and related ethical questions? How do you feel 5 works with other entheogenic medicines? What are the relationships? Who should take 5? Who shouldn't? What role do you see for 5 in the global community? What are the lessons you've learned from serving 5? Do you see serving 5 as being different from serving other entheogenic medicines? How? Why? What concerns, if any, do you have about the surging interest in 5 globally and the sharp increase in demand for the experience and its possible negative impacts on toads? What hopes do you have with 5 and the experiences it makes possible for people? Have you been public about your work with 5? For example, presented at conferences, World Bufo Alvarius Congress, given interviews, etc. If so, how do you navigate being public? I also presented a third possibility as an alternative to either formatting their own submission or answering the questions listed above. The submission could come in an interview format. The logic behind this third option is that my podcast, The Entheogenic Evolution, has been a home to having discussions about 5-MeO DMT since its inception in 2008. I made the offer of either transcribing a previous interview that had been featured on my podcast, or, alternatively, having contributors come on the podcast for an interview that would then be transcribed and used in this book. Both options have been taken by contributors, so some of the entries are in conversation format between myself and the contributors, or a reworked version of the conversation into an individual presentation. Because I've been very prolific over the years since 2008 in writing about, sharing about, and conversing about 5-MeO-DMT, many of the submissions in this collection mention me or my work, as I've been the source of information for many people first discovering 5-MeO-DMT or entering into the world of 5. This was not intentional on my part, but it was probably inevitable given how much I've focused on this molecule, how it works, and how to work with it. Readers will also probably note that many submissions refer to non-duality and non-dual states of consciousness, which is also, at least in part, due to my influence on the discourse. At times, there are references to pre-existing non-dual traditions, meanings, interpretations, and teachings. For myself, my non-dual take on 5-MeO-DMT, and subsequently on reality in general, came directly from my experiences with this molecule. When I wrote my 2009 book, Being Human, I first articulated there what I described as my radical non-duality and the worldview that had arisen via my personal experiences, which I've named the entheological paradigm. Something that I've often argued is that while the non-dual experience is the non-dual experience, and at the deepest levels, it doesn't really matter how it was accessed. I'm also of the view that 5-MeO-DMT is its own unique energetic vehicle, and as such, have preferred not to make reference to any pre-existing non-dual traditions or teachings. In my opinion, the maps of consciousness and being generated by such traditions do not necessarily fit with either the 5-MeO-DMT experience in particular, or psychedelic states in general. So my non-duality doesn't come from any non-dual religion or spiritual tradition, though some who facilitate 5-MeO-DMT do seek to use traditional non-duality as a lens through which to explore and understand the 5-MeO-DMT experience. From the traditional perspective, non-duality is most clearly associated with religious and spiritual traditions that developed in India. However, once we get into the various traditions of India, what becomes clear is that the maps, methods, and conceptualizations of the process of attaining non-dual states varies tremendously, and even while many such religions make use of similar terms, they mean very different things in different traditions. For example, most religions originating from India contain the concept of karma, but the meaning of this term is radically different from one religion, or even sect or branch, to another. So making the assumption that they're using the same term so they must have a similar meaning is entirely incorrect. Jains, Buddhists, and Hindus all have very different views of what karma is, how it is accumulated, how one gets rid of it, and what the process and experience of liberation and enlightenment are. And even making a statement like Hindus believe karma is X is highly problematic, as there are so many versions of Hinduism, let alone Buddhism. One such term, which makes its appearance in these pages in different submissions, is the Sanskrit word samadhi. Samadhi has been adopted as a nickname for 5-MeO-DMT within the wider culture. In the religions of India, samadhi is used to refer to the highest states of meditative awareness, often with an emphasis on non-duality, but not always. It is a word that is used across numerous traditions, but can have radically different meanings depending on context, historical development, cultural interactions, and adaptations. Buddhist samadhi is not necessarily equivalent to Hindu samadhi, or Jain samadhi, or yogic samadhi, or Sikh samadhi. And within religions, Zen Buddhist samadhi isn't necessarily the same as Tantric Buddhist samadhi. Or within Hinduism, we also have the various Vedantic schools that span from non-dual, qualified non-dual, to dual. So, do you see the problem? When we, in the 5-MeO-DMT community, use the term samadhi, what precisely do we mean? That's why I've preferred to use the language of energy to describe the process of working with 5-MeO-DMT without reference to any pre-existing concepts or traditions. In my opinion, it's cleaner and less burdened by cultural conceptuality, tradition, and doctrine. That's why I'm a self-described radical non-dualist. My non-duality comes from myself and my direct experience, not something that came before that may or may not be an ideal fit and weighed down by hundreds or even thousands of years of interpretation and reinterpretation. But of course, everyone here in this book has been welcome to approach these issues from whatever their own perspective is. I appreciate that where contributors use the term samadhi, they provide what they take its meaning to be. However, I will leave this part of the discussion with one example that should be illuminating and hopefully pique some curiosity. In the non-dual meditation religions of India, the universally taught and promoted body posture is that of seated meditation in lotus position with the legs crossed over themselves and hands held together with one overlapping the other, positioned at the navel. If samadhi is a state of consciousness experienced in meditation, then we can assume that fully energetically embodied experience is not relevant for the attainment of samadhi, and in fact, samadhi is generally articulated as an experience of consciousness where the body has been transcended. In contrast, when someone has a full release non-dual experience on 5-MeO DMT, individuals almost universally open their bodies in a spread eagle or star position, mainly due to the fact that they are experiencing infinite levels of energy coursing through their beings during that phase of the experience. I've written and shared much more about this phenomenon elsewhere, so I won't belabor the point here, yet this is an obvious and clear presentation of energetic difference between meditation and the energetic expansion that is the experience of 5-MeO DMT. They are not the same thing, as is made clear by how the experiences are embodied and articulated through body posture, movement, and expression. There's something very different going on here energetically, and this is obvious by how the experience is directly expressed in the body. Speaking of differences, let's return to the topic of 5-MeO DMT in comparison to DMT and other tryptamines. As there is still some confusion in the world about these differences, it's worthwhile exploring to some degree here where we have an opportunity to clear up some confusion. The other day, I was reading an article about how rich people were smoking toad, and in the article, 5-MeO DMT was referred to as toad DMT. 5-MeO DMT is not toad DMT, nor is it frog DMT, as it is sometimes called. 5-MeO DMT is not DMT. There are a wide variety of tryptamines that exist in the world, both out there in nature, as well as a diverse array that have been created in curious chemists' laboratories, such as was the case with the famed Sasha Shulgin. Without getting in-depth into the chemistry, a tryptamine is a molecule with a basic structure to which other elements can be added at various positions on the base molecule, and with each transformation of the base molecule, different biological, mental, emotional, and physical effects are generated. In mammals, tryptamines function as neurotransmitters and interact with receptor sites throughout the body, the brain, the heart, and the gut, all of which are comprised of neural tissue and networks and are in communication with each other. Naturally occurring tryptamines in humans include serotonin, melatonin, DMT, and 5-MeO DMT. In the lab, chemists have created other tryptamines, such as 5-MeO MIPT, 4-ACO DMT, 5-MeO DALT, and many, many others. As someone who's made it a point to try out many of these molecules, I can personally assure you that they're all very different from each other, though they do bear some family resemblance to one another. Beyond humans, tryptamines occur in all mammals. They are also found in a wide diversity of plants with different concentrations in different parts, such as seeds, leaves, roots, or bark. Curiously, toads also produce tryptamines in their protective secretions from their glands. All toads produce bufotenine, 5-HO-DMT, which tends to function as a nerve toxin, thereby making toads nasty meals for any would-be predators. One toad, however, Bufo alvarius, whose correct Latin name is Incilius alvarius, though since this is less often used and Bufo has come to be a shorthand for the secretions of this toad, the term bufo will be used throughout this book. In addition to producing 5-HO-DMT, also produces 5-MeO-DMT. This is the only toad in the world that does so and is the toad referred to when discussing 5-MeO-DMT. However, the amount of 5-MeO-DMT produced by the Colorado River toad, also known as the Sonoran Desert toad, varies, comprising around only 5 to 15% of the total secretions, so there's a complex array of other tryptamines and toxins present. Yet, the one and only reason anyone ever uses toad secretions is because it contains 5-MeO-DMT. While there may be some kind of entourage effect with toad secretions, the fundamental ingredient is 5-MeO-DMT, and it is this molecule and its effects which dominate the experience. The result is that you can get the same effects from lab-made 5-MeO-DMT in terms of energetic experience and potential for non-dual access, and there is no clear or unambiguous advantage to using toad secretions other than placating the desire to work with something natural as opposed to something made in a lab. The question of the entourage effect is addressed more thoroughly in the final chapter of Suggestions for Future Research. So, 5-MeO-DMT is a form of DMT, but it is not at all the same as DMT. The base molecule of DMT has a methoxylated addition on the 5 position, which is where we get the 5-MeO part of its name. At times, 5-MeO-DMT is simply referred to as 5-MeO or even just 5. But when the broader spectrum of tryptamines is taken into consideration, this can be confusing, as there are a number of other psychedelic molecules that also have a methoxylated addition at the 5 position. However, since 5-MeO-DMT is far more well-known and considered to be of special importance, we can get away with calling it 5 or 5-MeO, as virtually no one comes back with the response of, "You mean 5-MeO-MIPT?" When we say 5-MeO, it's generally understood what we're referring to. But the confusion with regular DMT persists, so let's clear some of that up. DMT and 5-MeO-DMT are extremely different molecules from a phenomenological perspective. They do have some commonalities, however. They are both extremely fast-acting when smoked or vaporized, are both extremely powerful, and also relatively short-acting, lasting more in the range of minutes as compared to hours, as is common for many psychedelic molecules. However, the similarities end there, and the differences are far starker and striking than any superficial similarity they share. DMT, for one, is far weaker in the sense that you need to use 10 times more molecule for a full experience than you do of 5-MeO-DMT. For example, a 10 milligram experience of 5-MeO-DMT is more potent than 100 milligrams of DMT. DMT is also much shorter acting, where a full DMT experience lasts 5 to 15 minutes compared to a full 5-MeO-DMT experience of 10 to 40 minutes. While the experience of both molecules includes the phenomenology of experiencing intense levels of energy in one's being, which can be somatic, mental, visual, emotional, cognitive, etc., the experience of DMT tends to amplify the ego, whereas 5-MeO-DMT holds the potential to completely dissolve the energetic structures of the ego. Part of the difference could be related to the fact that DMT is far more visual in nature than 5-MeO-DMT, and this visual augmentation, explosion really, perhaps preserves the subject-object relationship of the ego, and that it is so radically occupied with looking at really weird shit on DMT. Aliens, space stations, spirits, deities, machine elves, UFOs, etc. In other words, the ego on DMT is highly preoccupied with the question of what the fuck is that? To say that DMT is highly visual is a vast understatement. As McKenna praised it, it's the only psychedelic where I really hallucinate. Visually, DMT is simply over the top, and in that respect, we can safely say that it's about the most psychedelic, in the colloquial sense of the term, of all the psychedelics out there. Visually, it's extraordinarily colorful, engrossing, and highly geometric and fractal, and certainly very infinite. It's crazy. It's beautiful. It's terribly complex. It's engrossing and captivating. But it preserves and augments the ego, and then it's gone. 5-MeO-DMT, on the other hand, is not defined by its visual nature. Some people get no noticeable visual effects from 5-MeO-DMT, and those who do tend to describe it as being pure white or golden light that has fractal edges with iridescence in slight rainbow colors. This is extremely different from the hyper-saturated neon bright colors of DMT. For some, 5-MeO-DMT presents as the void, where all perception is completely empty of content, and this void may appear as either completely black or as filled with scintillating light, yet still paradoxically empty of any perception of thingness. And though there can be strong visual effects with 5-MeO-DMT, a common assessment after the fact, when the ego comes back online, is that visually it is crystal clear, and this refers not only to its visual quality, but also to the sense of Gnostic revelation and sense of being that is made accessible via this molecule. Both molecules can produce a near-death-like experience, but even here, there are profound differences. With DMT, it's most common for people to experience themselves as dying and then traveling out to some other place, which might be rationalized as some kind of afterlife realm. However, with 5-MeO-DMT, people experience themselves as dying and then, as the ego falls away and dissolves, suddenly find that they are the universal consciousness and being that is everyone and everything. In other words, people tend to travel out on DMT, whereas with 5-MeO-DMT, they tend to go to the center of all existence and being, and in that state, recognize the fundamental nature of reality as being identical with themselves without separation. In other words, DMT is predominantly dualistic in nature, whereas 5-MeO-DMT is fundamentally non-dualistic in nature. What becomes clear from the non-dual perspective is that all dualistic experiences wherein the ego is preserved, in some fashion, are a lesser order experience and not as fundamentally true as the sense of unitary being discovered in non-duality. To put it bluntly, DMT seems more of a show and a projection that is experienced by the often confused and odd ego, whereas 5-MeO-DMT presents as the fundamental nature of being and reality. That, to me, seems like a pretty darn big difference, and gets us well beyond McKenna's dismissive 5-MeO is just a feeling versus how much he hallucinates on DMT. There's a reason 5-MeO-DMT is sweeping the globe, and it's precisely because of this feeling that McKenna was unable to identify or articulate anything meaningful about. So, if you want to blow your mind and have a wild, psychedelic, highly hallucinatory ride, which, for the record, can be great fun, so don't think I'm dissing on it, then DMT is what you're looking for. However, if you want to get to the very heart of being and all of reality and truly know yourself at the deepest and most intimate level, and also have an opportunity to process and release all your egoic trauma and residue either on the way up or back down, then you'd never choose DMT over 5-MeO-DMT. In this matter, one is clearly superior to the other. They are not comparable, and they are not interchangeable. And for those few who still proclaim that DMT is more powerful than 5-MeO-DMT, I'm sorry, but I think you're profoundly mistaken. As far as I'm concerned, there's no real debate or question here. Which brings us to the question of why 5-MeO-DMT is considered to be so therapeutically significant. While both DMT and 5-MeO-DMT hold the potential to generate new neural networks, increase neuroplasticity, reduce inflammation, 5-MeO-DMT is therapeutically and also spiritually more significant precisely because of the work it does on the human ego. For example, when it comes to trauma, part of one's prior experience are blocked by protective mechanisms of the ego, which tend to trap the effects of trauma in one's psyche, emotional body, and physical body. By dissolving the structures of the ego, as 5-MeO-DMT does in spades, Unprocessed, unconscious, and unresolved material is given an opportunity to rise to the surface and process out. This is why, when people consume 5-MeO DMT, there can be so much screaming, crying, vomiting, and even full-body orgasms taking place. The experience allows for a profound energetic cleansing and reset. DMT rarely accomplishes this, and this is why researchers are focusing far more on the therapeutic potential of 5-MeO DMT than DMT. Furthermore, in scientific studies done on psychedelics, it has been found that the mystical experience tends to have the most therapeutic benefits for patients. Mystical can be defined in various ways, but in general, mystical is tended to mean a sense of being in the presence of God, or feeling unconditional love, of transcending all space and time, a sense of union with the divine, or, as articulated through non-duality, a sense of being one with all of reality, and as being identical with the universal consciousness. Hands down, 5-MeO DMT is by far the most mystical of any psychedelic substance. It also, more reliably than any other psychedelic, gives access to mystical and non-dual states of awareness. It also works much more quickly than other psychedelics in this regard. For example, someone could have a 6-hour deep mushroom trip and might only catch a glimpse of the mystical experience for a few minutes or seconds. And if this aspect of the experience is the more therapeutically beneficial, then why not get right to it with a fast-acting compound such as 5-MeO DMT that can get you there within seconds, rather than an hours-long experience that might not ever get you there, and also allows for deep egoic processing on the way up and the way down, all fit within a 20 to 40 minute time frame. It is precisely for this reason that many companies and researchers around the world are currently working on developing therapeutic delivery methods for 5-MeO DMT. You could potentially treat far more patients in a shorter period of time and with more reliable results than the day-long attention and care it takes to work with psilocybin or MDMA. It is important to note, however, that all psychedelic therapy carries the risk of trauma. This is probably least concerning with MDMA, to which most people react very favorably, as it's, in most cases, an extremely feel-good experience. However, a powerful mushroom journey at doses powerful enough to give access to a mystical experience can be hellish and deeply traumatizing for hours for someone who's having a difficult experience or resisting. The same holds true for 5-MeO DMT. The experience is simply so powerful, so profound, so incredibly overwhelming that some people find it to be deeply traumatic, confusing, and producing lasting difficulties post-experience. And this can occur even in the most carefully regulated ceremonial or therapeutic space with well-trained facilitators. While context can contribute to a traumatic experience, it's mostly an internal phenomenon and often caused by the individual's inability to trust, surrender, and let go fully into the experience and allow the energy to process naturally. It's important to note that this is not necessarily an easy process, so it isn't to blame anyone for not doing it right, as this is big medicine, and not everyone can process the experience cleanly. And here's the thing. You never know what you're going to get. Some people, such as in some of the submissions included in this book, are of the opinion that only those with significant prior psychedelic experience, or those who are well grounded in a spiritual or meditative tradition, should attempt to experience 5-MeO DMT because it is so monumental and powerful. However, from my own experience, I'd say that neither prior psychedelic experience or experience with spiritual or meditative traditions has any real bearing on one's chances of surrendering and allowing the experience of 5-MeO DMT to unfold without resistance by the ego. In my direct experience, I've seen people with years of prior psychedelic and meditative experience have total freakouts on 5-MeO DMT, where it scared the shit out of them, and have also seen people with zero psychedelic or meditative experience do beautifully on 5-MeO DMT. When it comes to the question of who should take 5-MeO DMT, my personal answer is anyone who wants to get to the heart of being and is willing to take the risks involved. No prior experience is necessary, and it's important to note that because the experience of 5-MeO-DMT is so radically powerful and unique, no prior experience can really prepare anyone for it. Because I see 5-MeO-DMT as an equal opportunity non-dual agent, I do recommend that people learn as much about the potentials of the experience as possible prior to attempting to experience or work with it. For me, the best preparation is education, which is precisely why I've dedicated so much of my work around providing the world with detailed and comprehensive information about all aspects of working with 5-MeO-DMT from an insider's perspective. And while this book here obviously goes beyond my personal perspective and experience, it's following along with the same intent, to educate people around the topic of how different individuals facilitate 5-MeO-DMT and what they perceive from their experience as defining features of working with this profound molecule and entheogenic agent. Something that I'm sure everyone included here would agree with is the requirement that anyone looking to facilitate 5-MeO-DMT, whether it be ceremonially, therapeutically, or spiritually, must have ample experience with the molecule first. This is one of those things that if you don't know it from the inside, then you literally have no idea. The non-5-MeO-DMT initiated mind cannot in any way understand what the experience is like. If it helps, think of it this way. Every idea you have is a product of your ego. If, as is generally held in the 5-MeO-DMT community, this molecule effectively dissolves your ego, then you literally cannot have an idea of the experience that is accurate. You can use words, concepts, and language to discuss it after the fact, but prior to going in, you have no idea what you're getting into. Part of the problem is the fundamentally paradoxical nature of reality and being. As is revealed by the non-dual experience of 5-MeO-DMT, we are all simultaneously the person we think we are and identify as, yet are also all the universal consciousness and being, God. We are simultaneously this one right here, and also everything and everyone else, and also no thing and universal, without separation or boundaries. As an analogy, it's kind of like how things are in quantum physics, where objects exist as both discrete particles and waves simultaneously. At the thoroughly dualistic and particleized end of the spectrum, we appear to just be this person right here. At the thoroughly universal waved end of the spectrum, we are everything and nothing. We are God. Yet somehow, paradoxically, both are true simultaneously. We are both this and that, and also nothing all at once. Talk about a mind bender. If that doesn't pull the proverbial rug out from underneath your experience of reality, then I don't know what will. The ego doesn't necessarily like this situation. The ego, as expressed through conceptuality, likes things to either be this or that, but not both at the same time. The key, to my mind, is about finding balance, centeredness, and authentic embodiment. Such, however, is not about adopting the right beliefs, ideas, doctrine, or ideology. Balance, centeredness, and authentic embodiment must be found within. It cannot come from outside the individual. And this is precisely why 5-MeO-DMT is such a powerful agent. It gives one the opportunity to explore this directly, energetically, and in an intimately embodied way. It's not about what you think or believe. It's about how you are being. And in order to get there, you'll most likely need to process, release, and transmute a great deal of personal, egoic, and individual life history material along the way. And the route to get there via 5-MeO-DMT is much faster and more reliable than any other methodology available to humanity. I take up this topic again in the first appendix to this volume, where I discuss how embodiment is crucial to what we can understand as genuine integration of 5-MeO-DMT that goes beyond standard wellness protocols for integrating psychedelic experience. 5-MeO-DMT, simply put, is not only a game changer, I think it's also the game changer. It's the greatest molecular technology available to humanity for personal transformation and self-awareness. That's the reason I like to call it the crown jewel of entheogens. And again, I think the God molecule captures its spirit rather nicely as well. Now that 5-MeO-DMT is out in the world, there are some common terms and phrases that are in use around it that we can delve into here for those reading this collection of accounts who are perhaps unfamiliar with some of the terminology that has become standard for those of us on the inside of the 5-MeO-DMT universe. First, there are some phrases that are associated with different levels of the 5-MeO-DMT experience and also related to doses, though this is from the experiential level and cannot be clearly demarcated by dose or milligram weight, as different people react differently to different doses at different days and times. Always remember, results vary. The handshake dose. This is generally meant to indicate that the person being served is receiving what is expected to be a small introductory dose, and not one that is intended to dissolve the ego and grant access to a non-dual state. I like to say that the ego is like a gravity well in space-time. Unless enough energy is introduced, everything near it will fall into its orbit. With enough energy, you can reach escape velocity and break free of the gravity well. 5-MeO-DMT does this, but only when enough has been provided, and this varies, so there's no magic number that is universally applicable. With the handshake, the idea is that the participant can dip their toes into the 5-MeO-DMT experience without having their ego threatened with total annihilation. It's important to note that different facilitators have very different opinions about first introducing clients, patients, initiates to the molecule with a low dose such as this. For some, it is important to gradually work individuals up to higher doses, whereas for others, this is seen as potentially misleading, as the ego can develop the idea of, oh, this isn't so radical, I can manage this, and cause it to freak out even more when it finally reaches the non-dual threshold at a higher dose. Some people who facilitate never go beyond these low doses as they don't want to have to manage the explosive potential of what takes place at higher doses. Some facilitators see these low doses as a waste of time and medicine, so opinions differ. The hug dose. This would be a level above the handshake where the individual is given a bit more. When working with a pure molecule, this can be the difference of only a milligram or two more, and afford it a deeper and more enveloping 5-MeO-DMT experience. At this level, the ego is still largely intact, but the overall energy of the experience is noticeably increased. The energy of 5-MeO-DMT has a steep logarithmic climb, so things get more powerful very quickly when increasing the dose. But at this level, since the ego isn't fully dissolved, it can actually be more confusing for some individuals than a larger dose. It's not easy to turn off the ego, which always thinks it should be doing something, and in these intermediate dose ranges, it often has no idea what to do with itself, so it gets confused, attempts to control, and struggles to intellectualize what it is experiencing. But at this point, it's starting to get the idea that what might be coming next with a larger dose will be well out of its comfort zone of prior experience or frame of reference. The full release, full surrender, or complete embrace dose. This is used for a dose that holds the potential for a full non-dual experience with the understanding that even at these levels, it is still possible for the ego to hold on, resist, avoid, or otherwise co-opt the experience, so a non-dual experience isn't guaranteed. Just like to escape the gravity well of a planet, a rocket needs enough fuel, though merely having enough fuel isn't a guarantee that a rocket won't explode upon liftoff, go off course, or crash. The same holds true for higher doses of 5-MeO-DMT. There's no guarantee. However, the expectation at this level is that the one taking it has the potential to completely dissolve the egoic structures and enter full absorption in an infinitely expanded energetic state. At this stage, there are no perceptions of separation, boundaries, or limits. There is no longer an observing self or that which is observed, as there is no longer a distinction between subject and object, and it is the experience of the immediate suchness of being. It is beyond concepts, beyond belief, and is overwhelming, ecstatic, and for many, blissful and loving. Which brings us to our next term, that of the whiteout, or alternatively, the blackout. At high doses, many, especially those who are just beginning their explorations with 5-MeO-DMT, are unable to maintain conscious awareness of their experience and therefore have a discontinuity in consciousness. This is most likely due to the fact that 99% of all humans have zero reference for experience that is not filtered through the ego, and therefore the self-identified person in egoic consciousness is rendered unaware of the non-dual experience. For some, as the energy of the medicine opens up, everything turns to white light, the ego dies, and then, once the energy starts to wane, the ego comes back online, and the person describes how everything turned to light, and then the next thing they know, they find themselves back in their body in egoic awareness, and they might have zero recall of what their experience over the last 10 minutes or so was. Similarly, for some, everything goes dark, and they black out and then regain consciousness via the reappearance of the ego at a later time. While such an event can indicate that a person had too much, this is not necessarily the case. Often, it's an experience that transforms over time as the individual becomes more experienced with maintaining awareness, where it can distinctly be observed that the ego very clearly comes and goes, but awareness remains. Furthermore, it's common that aspects of the experience of a white or blackout filter back into awareness over subsequent days and months in a process that is very similar to how one might not remember a dream upon waking, only to have bits and pieces of a significant dream come back into awareness as events or situations trigger recall due to something appearing or feeling familiar to something that was present within the dream. Somewhat the opposite of a white or blackout is the phenomenon that has been labeled as a spontaneous reactivation. This is where a 5-MeO-DMT experience, where no 5-MeO-DMT has actually been consumed, breaks open into everyday consciousness and experience, post-experience of having consumed the molecule. Back in 2008, after my second 5-MeO-DMT experience, the following day I was sitting in meditation, and as I was exhaling, I knew that somehow, if I just followed my breath all the way, I'd go back in to the 5 experience. And that's exactly what happened. What followed was indistinguishable between what was happening to me right then and there and the experience of taking a hit of 5-MeO-DMT. It then happened every day for the next 2 weeks. When I informed the person who had facilitated for me, he'd never heard of this happening. So I was the first person that I'd ever heard of having this kind of experience. A few months later, when I started a new relationship and was taking my new partner for her own experiences with the Temple of Awakening Divinity, she started waking up between 2 and 3 a.m. in the morning after her second or third experience with the medicine, fully back in the medicine. And for her, this was jarring, scary, and extremely uncomfortable. She was the first person of the 3 of us, herself, me, and our facilitator, where we'd seen this kind of reaction. Now that many more people have experienced 5-MeO-DMT and reported their own experience of after effects, we now know that both of these situations are relatively common, though not universal, post-5-MeO-DMT experience. Some people find that their meditation is suddenly far more powerful and energetic than ever and easily slip into a 5-MeO-DMT-like experience in meditation. And for many others, waking up most often between 2 and 3 a.m. in the morning, or for others immediately upon transitioning from being awake to falling asleep, and having a full 5-MeO-DMT-like experience, which, in the moment, appears indistinguishable from the real thing, is also very common. And just like my then partner and now wife and myself, these spontaneous reactivations tend to subside within a couple of weeks once they start. At the time, in 2008, this was new to all of us. We now know that this is rather common, and such events have come to be called spontaneous reactivations, or simply reactivations. At times, some people refer to these events as flashbacks, but this term doesn't really capture the experience. You're not flashing back because it's all happening right here, right now, and need not mirror or imitate your actual experience with 5-MeO-DMT. For example, my second experience with 5-MeO-DMT was one of releasing years of pent-up and repressed emotional pain that came out in the form of wailing, screaming, and crying. In my reactivations, I never flashed back to that releasing of pain. Rather, my reactivations were ecstatic, expansive, and energetically powerful. While they had a decidedly 5-MeO-DMT feel to them, they were not echoes of my most recent 5-MeO-DMT experience. Regardless, it is this kind of breaking through into ordinary reality that is referred to by the use of the term reactivation. Not everyone gets this, but many do. In some instances, it's an indication that the energy of the 5-MeO-DMT has not been fully expressed and processed. In others, it just means someone is available to go deeper into the moment of being and not necessarily a manifestation of unprocessed energetic materials. As has been mentioned, individuals can experience a great deal of releasing and purging on either the way up to the pinnacle of non-duality or on the descent back down into the ego. These can take all manner of forms: vibrations and tremors in the body, vomiting, drooling, screaming, crying, involuntary body movements, somatic processing, emotional outbursts, acting out, fighting, trying to run away, flopping around, becoming hypersexual, etc. This is another area where we find a great deal of diversity and also see how deeply personal each experience is, as is it is always a reflection of the individual's energetic state in that very moment. This is where unconscious patterns, choices, and limitations come to the surface to be sorted, expressed, released, and transformed. This is where a lot of the juice of working with 5-MeO-DMT is found. It is through such energetic processing that individuals are effectively able to recalibrate their energetic being as restricted through the confines of the ego, and is also an indication that someone is not merely engaging in spiritual bypassing, where the difficult aspects of being human are pushed aside and ignored for the desire to attain bliss and perfection. Being human is a messy, difficult business, and everyone has energetic blocks and residuals to process through if they are truly seeking to transform, empower, and recalibrate themselves into a cleaner, more centered, and authentic vehicle for the one universal consciousness to experience itself through. No one actually smokes toad. This phrase gets tossed around a lot, but it isn't literally accurate. When people say they smoked toad, what they mean is that they smoked, or more often vaporized, the secretions of Bufo alvarius. In the 5-MeO-DMT community, this is simply referred to as Bufo, toad, toad medicine, and sometimes Bufo toxin. Furthermore, no one licks toads. While it's a fun song, Thomas Dolby's song featuring Imogen Heap, The Toad Lickers, doesn't reference anything anyone anywhere actually does. Secretions from the toad are collected, dried, and then vaporized. And while it's cool that Neil Gaiman has one of his characters in American Gods vaporizing synthetic toad skins, that's about as far off from reality as anyone can get when it comes to toad and 5-MeO-DMT. When individuals specifically reference 5-MeO-DMT, 5-MeO, or simply 5, they are generally referring to what we could broadly classify as the pure molecule, which might reference something either made in a lab or extracted from various plants and grasses that naturally contain this molecule. For lab-made 5-MeO-DMT, it's often referred to as synthetic, which, while technically accurate, is often so labeled dismissively by those whose egoic preference is for what they categorize as natural and therefore better. This bias, at times, is so extreme that there have been facilitators who have claimed that synthetic is completely inferior to natural toad medicine and even proclaimed it to be ineffective. As someone who does not share this bias, and as someone who has experienced toad medicine, extracted 5-MeO-DMT, and lab-made 5-MeO-DMT, it's my opinion that they are all equally effective and there is no fundamental difference. Non-duality itself presents a challenge to this distinction between natural and synthetic, because at the foundation, all of reality is experienced as one unitary being, and therefore everything that exists in the dualistic world is all equally God. From this perspective, there is no fundamental difference between a molecule found in nature or one created in a lab. They both have an identical molecular structure and are made of the same elements. It's only their origin that is different, and when it comes to chemicals, origin is largely irrelevant, unless one chooses to project various spiritual metaphysics onto chemistry. How a molecule is made does not affect its efficacy in my experience and perspective. Contrary to those who espouse the virtues of natural over synthetic, based on online surveys and self-reporting, synthetic or pure molecule 5-MeO-DMT seems to produce fewer negative reactions and traumatic experiences than toad. Because toad contains a variety of other compounds, it is more likely to have complex interactions with an individual's biochemistry. Furthermore, it is impossible to measure exact dosage with toad, whereas it's quite simple with the pure molecule. The treatment of toads and their possible exploitation and harm is something that is of interest within the 5-MeO-DMT community. Though it is illegal to collect and harvest toads in the U.S., it isn't in Mexico, and with the surging interest in toad medicine, more and more people are going out into the desert in the monsoon months to collect toad secretions. Ironically, this situation has been made worse by making 5-MeO-DMT illegal in the U.S. Prior to January 19, 2011, it was extremely easy to get the pure molecule form from chemical laboratories in the U.S. All it took was going online, placing an order, and then awaiting its arrival in one's mailbox. Pretty simple. Now, however, anyone in the U.S. who wants to work with a pure molecule must turn to the black market and illegal underground, and for many, taking a trip out to the desert to catch some toads is a more ideal option. Additionally, people in Mexico now advertise the selling of toad secretions to a global marketplace on social media. It's not unreasonable to ask what effect this is having on the toads and their viability and overall well-being as individuals and as a species. Yes, it's cool that this one toad has the world's most potent entheogen in it just waiting to be squeezed out and collected and made available to humans. As a character in one of my novels expresses, no one suspects a toad. But do our interests in 5-MeO-DMT justify how the toads are treated? Honestly, humans don't have a very good track record with use of natural resources, particularly in the modern era. Ethically and practically speaking, it might be best if everyone used synthetic 5-MeO-DMT, which, to reassert, is perfectly effective and is in no way inferior to toad. We can love nature, leave it alone, and still have access to the experience that we're looking for. If only we could ask the toads what they think. Which is another aspect of the toad phenomenon. There are those in the 5-MeO-DMT community who do claim to speak for the toads, or for their spirit, and consider themselves as in communication with toad intelligence. Personally, I'm someone who is thoroughly skeptical of any and all spiritual claims, and from my position as a non-dualist, it's all you anyway, so I tend to view such claims as a form of psychological projection and transference. However, there are those who come from more of a shamanic background or perspective who like to talk about the spirit of the toad. This can be harmless, but it can also delve into spiritual doctrine or ideology, and that's where I get concerned. Once we start getting into what people believe, things start to get messy and metaphysics almost always come into play. If the goal is to be grounded in what is, metaphysics is always a leap beyond what is to what I think it is. and here it opens up all kinds of ontological and epistemological questions that most are not really equipped to engage with in a meaningful way other than to state their beliefs. There are a few other terms and phrases that are worthwhile to attend to before I let you go and dive into the anthology. As different people facilitate in different ways in different contexts, the person being facilitated for might be referred to in various forms. For some, the person is a client. For others, it might be a patient. And for still others, it might be a participant or even an initiate. Furthermore, for some facilitators, the act of serving 5-MeO-DMT is a session, and the session might be divided into several rounds of consuming the medicine. For others, it's a ceremony, and it might be the serving of communion. For some, it's a medicine, and for others, it might be a drug. It all depends on context and perspective, and purported aims of the event. As the editor, I've sought to keep some uniformity in language and terms, but also allow each contributor to speak in their own language and terminology. As editor, my hand is at play in various ways throughout these contributions. Many have come from individuals whose first language isn't English, and in some cases, editing has been extensive to make the entry easily readable in English. I've also converted any non-American English spellings into American English. In the case of transcribed interviews, these have been edited for clarity and readability. Most of us don't speak the way we write, or vice versa, so there's always massaging that happens with transcriptions to avoid incomplete sentences, interjections, run-ons, or what have you. Also, at times where I, as editor, felt that some background information could be relevant, I have occasionally inserted clearly labeled editor's notes. Though I am no longer a facilitator of 5-MeO-DMT, I was, and practiced for 7 years. My takeaway from what I learned in those years became the source for my book, Entheogenic Liberation. Anyone who isn't familiar with that work and who wants to know how I saw the practice of facilitating 5-MeO-DMT from my own perspective is welcome to read that book. Because I've written and shared about this so thoroughly and comprehensively there, I'm not including any kind of entry about facilitation from myself in this collection. This is an opportunity for others to share their views, methods, and concerns. To conclude this introduction, I'd like to reiterate that this collection is not meant to be evaluative. This is not a book about how one should or should not facilitate 5-MeO-DMT. It is a book about how different people approach working with this molecule in the practice of serving others and their concerns and perspectives. As I wrote above, being included in this collection is not an endorsement. As you'll find, there's a wide variety of perspectives and practices covered in the material that follows. There are highly structured ceremonial procedures and more therapeutic and non-spiritual perspectives. There are entries from individuals who have been facilitating for years, and others from those who are relatively new to their practice. It's all welcome here as a survey of what people are doing and what they think of what they're doing. There's been no criteria for who is qualified to participate in this book versus who isn't. Regardless of how anyone thinks facilitating 5-MeO-DMT should happen, the reality is that different people have different perspectives, values, and methods. And when it comes to recipients or participants, some people are very comfortable with a large group ceremony that lasts hours, and others are entirely disinterested in such. Some people like being in a group or going on a retreat, and others would like to work one-on-one, get in, get their experience, and go home. Some people want to be part of a larger community of spiritual seekers, and others just want to overcome their childhood trauma and move on with their lives. Just as there is diversity among facilitators, so too is there among the potential clientele. There are spiritual seekers and people seeking healing. There are those who are committed to personally discovering the truth of existence and the nature of being, and those who are curious about what all the hype is about this molecule. In my view, there's room enough for all of us. Hopefully, this collection reflects this. In contrast with much of what is presented in this volume, upon invitation, I've included an appendix that has been submitted by the Conclave, which is an anonymous collection of 5-MeO-DMT facilitators, educators, and enthusiasts. Here, The Conclave has produced a document concerning the topic of best practices when it comes to the facilitation of 5-MeO-DMT. As the document recognizes that there are many approaches, it fits well with this collection and adds some perspective on what certain members of the 5-MeO-DMT community collectively consider to fall within the scope of best facilitation for all involved. To get us started, we'll begin where I began, with the Temple of Awakening Divinity. This is purely for the fact that it was at the Temple of Awakening Divinity that I was first able to really experience the fullness of what 5-MeO-DMT had to offer, so it seems a fitting place to begin this anthology. As I've mentioned at the time, in 2008, this was the only context in which I personally knew that 5-MeO-DMT was being facilitated. It's far more structured than most, and personally, it's not my style. But it did provide me with the opportunity to explore 5-MeO-DMT over the course of an extremely transformative period of my life, and therefore, in mirror of my own experience, it's where we'll get started. For those of you who have contributed to this collection, thank you. Obviously, this book wouldn't be happening without your willingness to share, be open, and be vulnerable. I hope you have found creating your contribution to be worthwhile, enjoyable, and an opportunity to deeply express and share yourself and your passion. For those of you reading, I hope you enjoy this collection and find it informative. May your path lead to the only place there really is to go, yourself, in all your infinite glory. Before we get to the entry from Hal in the Temple of Awakening Divinity, I do have a special added bonus to the audiobook to share with you, the listener. Here is my story, as set to music, about my first full 5-MeO-DMT experience at the Temple of Awakening Divinity.
A month later, he invites me back. He's like, okay, this time I have some pure freebase 5-MeO-DMT, and we're going to try this one. I was like, oh, okay. And he also had a new vaporizer by this point. So this vaporizer has a glass piston. So it's like this glass cylinder, and there's a piston at the top. And the chamber itself is filled with argon gas. And so he'd light it from the bottom with a torch lighter. And then the whole chamber would fill up with the vapor. And you can see this kind of milky white vapor in there. And he holds the pipe. So he brings it over to me. And then, he's into magic. So a magical phrase is in perfect love and in perfect trust. So he says that, in perfect love and in perfect trust. So I take my hit, and the piston, I'm watching the piston, and the piston gets down to right about there, so about 2/3 of the way through the hit. And I don't know exactly, I think there might have been maybe 25 milligrams of freebase 5-MeO in the chamber. So I didn't get all of it. I got down to about there. But even at that point, I didn't take the rest of the hit, because when I got to there, it was just like, oh my God, it's happening. And it just instantly became infinite, and it got larger and larger and larger and larger and larger and larger. And all I could do was say, thank you, thank you, thank you, God, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And that's about all I did for about 45 minutes. And it was just wave after wave after wave of infinite, unconditional love without any boundaries. It was just infinite, infinite. And I also recognized that it was me. And it wasn't Martin. It's not this guy. But it was me. And then I very distinctly, towards the end of the experience, I could feel, oh, there's the first layer of my egos. Because eventually, as it was coming on, it was just like the starlight. It was just fractaline starlight. It was just scintillating. And everything in reality dissolved. I didn't see the room. I didn't see anybody else in there. And I would also say at that very beginning, it was very much, my first thought was, oh shit, I've done it now, I'm dying. But I was at this place in my life where I was really just ready to embrace any kind of change. So I just said, great, yes, let's do it. So there was zero resistance. There was no conscious resistance. There was no unconscious resistance. It was just an absolute yes that was flowing through me. So I just popped right over. And then eventually, at some point, I might have been sitting up. I don't even know what I was doing. I don't know if I was lying there the whole time, but at some point I sat up. And then I noticed, oh, wait, human form. That's kind of the first thing that clicked, is that I noticed there was another human being. And I was like, oh, another human form. And then that's when my ego started to come back, when I started to realize, oh, I can identify this thing over here, and it's a human. And then the next was, oh, human male, but I don't know who it is. And then, oh, human female. And then next came names, like, oh, I have to call him Hal, that's not his name. Oh, that's Hal. And oh, that's Maya over there. So then eventually everything came back. And yes, at that point, I was absolutely 100% completely astounded, because there had never been anything like that happen in my life, ever. It was so unique, so distinct, and it was just this sense of, this is exactly what I've been looking for my entire life, but had no idea that this is what I was looking for. And from that point, I was, like I said, I was really wishy-washy about the word God. It's like, don't even use the word God. Like, we can talk about source, or we can talk about consciousness, but don't even use the word God. I had a lot of aversion to that. But after that event, my position was, okay, I don't believe God is real, because now I know God is real. That everything is just one universal consciousness. That's all that really exists. And this one consciousness is performing as the objects of reality. It is performing as other people. It's performing as animals. It's performing as me. But that's what I really am. That in my true nature, I am this universal consciousness that is made out of the pure energy of unconditional love. That's it. There was no question about that for me. So I always call that my first full experience with 5-MeO DMT. That everything that I experienced before then with Yopo, and the first experience with Bufo, with toad secretions, that wasn't it. It didn't tell me what 5-MeO was really about, but this one did. So that was my first real introduction. And that then started initiating a cascade of transformations within me. And so I identify this time period. That was the very beginning of 2008 through the spring of 2009. I identify that as my transformation period.